Take a look at these. And now, these. Clearly, a lot has happened. Now, I want to zoom in on some key turning points that can help us better understand the history of the Mexican drug trade. Some of you might be thinking, oh well, there was this super cartel in the late 70s and 80s, and when that broke up it splintered, and then those splinters splintered, and then those splintered. That is partially true, and that's the Narcos narrative, but then there's also much more to it than that. Which state agencies controlled the drug trade and when? At what point did the traffickers start taking charge? How does Colombia fit into the history? Now, I want to rewind nearly a century back so we can really answer this question: how the hell did this happen?
Mexico, the military there killed the country's most powerful drug lord.
One, Tríangulo Dorado. World War II. You might have heard of it. This is our first turning point. By the way, guys, this video is pretty low on stats, dates, things like that. What I really want to do is give you a macro picture of Mexico's narcotics history, so that when you zoom in on more detailed aspects of the history, you can contextualize it within the broader arc of the trade's evolution. And one more thing, I'll be very quick. So much of the material here I got from this book right here, The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade by Professor Benjamin T. Smith. Buy it, read it. It is essential reading for anyone interested in this topic, and to my knowledge, it's the first and best English language book on the broader history of the Mexican drug trade. Okay, now jumping back in. America has had a bit of a love-hate relationship with drugs and alcohol going back at least a couple of centuries. Up to the 1960s, recreational drugs in the States weren't really widespread, not nearly as much as today. But of course, it was still a social issue. There was still addiction, overdoses, gang violence. The main category of drugs for North Americans, if we're excluding things like alcohol, tobacco and sugar, was opiates, drugs made from the sap of the poppy plant. So opium, morphine, and their derivatives, codeine and heroin. What World War II does is it massively disrupts supply chains from Europe and Asia. Mexico, which already had a long history of cross-border smuggling, it steps in to fill the gap. American gangs have the criminal networks, the labs, the chemical precursors, but what they don't have so much is that air-dried poppy sap, the raw opium. Now, drugs aren't as much of a domestic problem in Mexico as they are in the States, but Mexicans are familiar with opium, and that's because it had been introduced by Chinese migrants, especially from the 1800s onwards. This is an opium den, where they'd go and smoke up in the company of others, fairly common in the major urban hubs and the northern border cities. By the late 20s, though, there are a bunch of racist pogroms against the Chinese, and Mexican officials generally encourage them. The Chinese and their opium eventually get kicked out, and the Mexicans begin taking over the trade. First in the state of Sonora, but then it spreads south to Sinaloa, and from there outward to neighboring Durango and Chihuahua. Connecting these three states is an enormous mountain chain called the Sierra Madre Occidental. Peasants have been living there in abject poverty for decades. Because of simple geography, with the Sierra's towering mountains and deep shaded valleys, they were almost completely cut off from the state. But that isolation also brought advantages, at least when it came to the criminal economy. One, natural protection from Mexico's hyper-strict drug laws. Yes, Mexico's were in fact far stricter than the US's. And as it turned out, agriculturally speaking, the region also offered pretty damn good conditions for growing poppy plants. So, a network of poppy farmers, entrepreneurs, cooks, and wholesale traffickers emerged, all banding together for that coveted sticky sap, fetching higher earnings than other locally grown crops like tomatoes or beans. Now, municipal leaders, sometimes not even state officials, just rural caciques or these informal mountain chiefs, they help organize the trade and resolve any disputes. Overall, it's peaceful, cooperative. In Sinaloa, a whole bunch of the entrepreneurs connecting the farmers to the wholesalers are buddies going back to the days of the Mexican Revolution. And they were the uncles and fathers of some of Mexico's first major kingpins. So relationships are mainly built on trust, on friendship, on family, and on good old-fashioned business. Women and children often work the fields too, so it's usually really a family affair. It's about farming, producing the opium, and then peddling it along northward. And violence, although it's pretty rare, only really flares up whenever the local state police move in to shake down and protect growers, peddlers, and other actors of the trade. These three states in the Sierra Madre Occidental become known as the Golden Triangle. To this day, the region is still one of Mexico's largest producers of opium and cannabis. Sinaloa back then, just like now, was the criminal epicenter of the three. The first key wholesalers and chemists came from there, and Sinaloan state officials were some of the first to tax and protect the trade at the state as opposed to the federal level. 2. Hippies. The 1960s changed Mexico forever. Rewinding back a little bit, Mexico's opium trade slumps by the end of the 40s. The government is under huge US pressure to crack down on narcotics. So what happens is, a bunch of French Corsicans out of Marseille become the shakers and movers of the heroin trade, and their opium mainly comes from Turkey. Again, opiates. Still a social issue in the US, still a lot of drug panic, but it is nothing compared with what's about to come. When weed takes off, the US experiences something completely different. The post-war boomers had grown up and they're anti most things of their parents' generation. Weed becomes wrapped up with the hippies and the countercultural movement, and it spreads all across the country, so that before long, it's not just hippies and countercultural types, but generally young demographic groups from suburban high schoolers to yuppie white collars. Mexico moves along with the demand. They realize this is a completely new kind of drug. It's a consumer drug. It's part of the zeitgeist, part of a whole generation. So many people are consuming it, a subculture grows around it, and people want different kinds of strains. You get scores of Mexican farmers in the Golden Triangle, including the old poppy farmers. They switch to weed for higher earnings, or they jump on the bandwagon from scratch. Soon, it absolutely explodes into a national industry with about a dozen of Mexico's 32 states involved. Thousands of smugglers also get in on the action. Many are actually educated American kids like this guy. But there are a couple of kingpins who etch their names in Mexican narco history, riding that green tidal wave. Those are Pedro Avilés Pérez in the 1960s, whom many of you will have heard of, and by the turn of the decade, the Cuban trafficker Alberto Cecilia Falcón. Both are major innovators and gifted organizers, connecting rural Mexico to the booming US weed market. Pérez's organization in particular provides formative apprenticeships to a whole flock of future Sinaloan kingpins. As for the state protection rackets, they get cranked up. It's the state police who enforce them. They tax any grower, wholesaler, or smuggler operating within state boundaries. In exchange, the police, they help them out with logistics, transportation, and crucially, they keep federal drug hawks off their scent. Violence overall is still pretty rare. The criminal taxes sometimes line the pockets of extortionate officials, but what we often see is the funds being redirected towards public works and infrastructure. That is to say, the drug trade in large part fuels the social and economic development of rural Mexico. 3. Condor. Some of you already know about this one. Operation Condor wasn't just some mythical origin story for Mexico's first cartel. It happened to be one of the most violent and traumatizing events in 1970s Mexico. On the American side, the decade had kicked off with a drug panic under President Nixon.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
Weed was pouring across the border, the French Corsican heroin gangs had been dismantled, but Mexico was now filling demand with their own homegrown product, a much stronger kind of heroin. Mexican brown or Mexican mud, as it was nicknamed, depending on the powderiness and quality. A turning point in its own right, Nixon declares drugs as public enemy number one in the United States. Later, he sets up the Drug Enforcement Administration. Its whole spiel is to police and combat the flow of drugs entering the US, but you already knew that. Around this time, the US starts putting huge pressure on Mexico to take counter-narcotics more seriously. So that means border shutdowns, it means diplomatic threats. Now, the PRI, which was the ruling party in Mexico's de facto one-party state going back to the late 20s, they see these drug-growing states going at it alone, resisting federal authority, so the PRI wants to go in and remind them who's boss. They want to centralize power over them. That means tougher drug laws, brutal new policing, and eventually massive drug eradication campaigns, particularly using chemical defoliant sprayed out of planes. Practically everything, except the military manpower, is bankrolled by the US. 1977 is when the joint anti-drug effort is cranked up to new heights. In a nutshell, the Mexican military is let loose over the states of the Golden Triangle. It is a human rights atrocity. Hundreds, if not thousands of peasants end up getting killed. Torture, rape, looting, extortion, all of these are widespread. Thousands of hamlets are destroyed, local economies are shattered, tens of thousands are forced to flee. All this, I should add, the Americans knew about and brushed it under the carpet. So, besides the human cost, what is the impact on the drug trade? Let's break this down in parts. Local protection rackets run by the state police are now severed. This now leaves a gaping vacuum for the federal government to step in. Loads of small traffickers and cultivators from the Golden Triangle are taken out in a sort of Darwinian purge. This paves the way for bigger traffickers to take over the trade and run operations elsewhere. And yes, the drug flow from Mexico is disrupted after the operations, but that's only temporary. The big traffickers soon pick up the supply, and they're now trafficking even more drugs, and not just weed, but South American cocaine. And this one's important. In the narco world, Operation Condor only strengthens resentment towards the state. They are two-faced. They are unscrupulous, they're American stooges, and they're despotic, terrorizing the little guys just to line their pockets. This is especially important as these sentiments are easily passed down the generations. 4. The Takeover. Okay, this happens around the same time as Operation Condor, and it's not a coincidence. As we saw, protection rackets had mainly been handled by state governors, and they were enforced by the state police. What happens in the mid-70s is you get a group of incredibly corrupt, high-level officials who start to infiltrate government departments. Men of legendary criminality like this guy, and him. What they do, and do successfully, is they dismantle local state protection rackets, often through murder and coercion, and they replace them with federal protection rackets. Now, the federal police, that's the PJF, the Policía Judicial Federal, and the PGR, the Attorney General's office, they're pretty much running the show. They centralize the trade out of Mexico City. Now, it's PJF commanders and federal prosecutors heading the much more violent protection rackets. They're extorting local traffickers for regular bribes, and they're charging non-local traffickers levies for moving drugs throughout the territory. They're known as plaza bosses, and they're mainly in the drug-producing and border states. Now, it should be said there are other state agencies trying to control and profit from the drug trade. There's still the local state police, for example, there's the military, and then there's the Special Services Agency. But in this period, it's the PJF and the PGR who really come out strongest. Its ringleaders are close to the presidency, and they're seasoned, particularly unscrupulous crooks. In this period, it's the efforts to control the plazas which is usually bringing the violence, particularly as the trade is becoming more and more lucrative with better, more diverse weed strains and the burgeoning market for cocaine. What we see then is Mexico rapidly shifting from a producer to an importer. 5. The Camarena Scandal. Many of you will already know about this one as well. Was its impact just the dismantling of a cartel? No. First, context. The Mexican trafficking scene has changed. Cocaine from South America is now firmly in, and it's flowing through Mexico and across the border. Weed, particularly seedless weed or sin semilla, is huge, and it's mainly homegrown. The city of Guadalajara has become Mexico's new trafficking hub. It's well connected to the main smuggling corridors, it's close to some important growing regions, it's already crawling with state-backed criminals, and the urban setting makes it easier for the state to control. Major Sinaloan traffickers have flocked there, and they're now doing a lot of business together. Since the exodus from Operation Condor, they're not protected by the state police anymore, they're protected by Mexico's Secret Services Agency, the DFS, or the Directorate of Federal Security. The DFS, for a little bit of history, had a short spell of high-level collusion with the drug trafficking scene all the way back in the 1940s. That was relatively short-lived. But now they're back, and they're protecting Mexico's most powerful traffickers. What we like to call Mexico's first cartel, the Guadalajara cartel, was largely their creation. The DFS helps the traffickers get organized, and it helps them get modernized. It should be said they have deep, long-standing ties to US Secret Services, especially the CIA. High-ranking insiders even said that the CIA were essentially calling the shots. Given later evidence of CIA collusion with Latin American drug traffickers, it seems extremely plausible they helped organize them too. Now, since the military crackdown on the older drug scene had wiped out much of the competition, these traffickers, with help from the DFS, they reinvent the Mexican trafficking scene. How do they do this? 1. By peddling this super profitable Colombian cocaine to North America. And 2, by crowdfunding enormous weed plantations in the middle of the desert. Technologically, there is a total sea change. Banks have become crucial for money laundering, and the Mexican marijuana scene has gone from geographically scattered and traditional to geographically concentrated and hyper-intensive. And then comes the catalyst. In February 1985, DEA agent Enrique Camarena is abducted by a group of corrupt Guadalajara cops on the traffickers' payroll. Over about 3 days, he is brutally tortured and interrogated, then murdered. The traffickers and a shadowy cabal of corrupt Mexican officials are behind it. Now, the Camarena case is still an investigative mess, even decades on. The mainstream narrative until quite recently is that the abductors wanted revenge for DEA crackdowns on their plantations and bank accounts. Now, while there may be some truth to this for some of the traffickers' motives, it's likely much bigger than that. What now seems to be highly plausible, though unconfirmed and probably unconfirmable, is that Camarena was abducted and interrogated for stumbling on a deep cover drugs for arms conspiracy implicating senior state officials, the DFS, and in particular the CIA. Money and arms to Contra rebels in leftist Nicaragua. But now returning to the central question, why was Camarena's death a turning point? Basically, the war on drugs gets jacked up, which means the DEA gets jacked up. Its budget doubles, its ranks balloon, and now the agency has much more power, prestige, and independence abroad. The Camarena case also gives it this renewed sense of purpose, a martyr figure to rally around. There is a great menace south of the border, endangering American lives and values, and it needs to be vanquished. The beefing up of the DEA and its more active role in Mexico is very important, because with aggressive anti-narcotics policing comes much more violence. Take down kingpins, you usually get power struggles and turf wars. You get splinter factions. Decapitate those splinter factions, you repeat the cycle, and now there's even more division. But this isn't all that happens. The DEA uses confidential informants to take down trafficking networks. It's effective to gain intel, but it also creates division. Now you get snitches and defectors. Criminals approach the DEA looking for a way out, or they get nabbed and are given the ultimatum, rat out your bosses and buddies, or you're going to be locked away for a while. More importantly, perhaps, anti-narcotics brings fear of snitches and defectors in organizations. That means paranoia, and that means more violence, both inside and outside other trafficking groups. This last one is key. The Mexican drug trade started out, as you remember, based on cooperation between the actors involved in the drug trade. Violence usually only broke out between state bodies vying for the protection rackets. But with the ramp up of the DEA and the splintering of trafficking groups, we see far more violence between rival organizations, and we see agency violence over who controls the plazas. It is a trend that only gets worse. 6. Traffickers take charge. This happens during the 90s. By the middle of the decade, the balance of power had already massively shifted. Major trafficking groups, so the Grillo Fuentes organization, the Arellano Felixes, the Gulf Cartel, they're now making dizzying amounts of money, and they're wielding unprecedented levels of power. Now, there are several reasons for this. The first is a trend that's been building up over the 80s and 90s, and some of you will have heard of it. The US crackdown on the Caribbean trafficking routes all the way up to Miami forces the Colombian suppliers and power brokers to become much more dependent on Mexican smugglers. So we see a gradual shift from the Caribbean corridor over to the Central American and Mexican corridor. By the mid to late 90s, the Caribbean route is pretty much sealed off, so this is huge for Mexico. There is another change, the change with a business model, and a tide-turning one at that. During the reign of the Colombian cartels, Mexican smugglers were typically paid by the kilo to smuggle drugs over the border before the drugs were handed to the Colombians' distributors. Because of the closure of the Caribbean corridor and the overall pressure on the Colombians now want to reduce their risk. At the same time, the Mexicans now have much more bargaining power to dictate new business terms. As a consequence, what comes out of that, and it's really a win-win for both, is what's known as the one-for-one system. For each kilo of Colombian coke that the Mexicans smuggle, they get one for themselves. This is key. Now, the Mexicans aren't just the mules, they've become wholesalers. Now they're selling directly to buyers across the border. Yes, they're facing much more risk, but they also managed to increase their earnings tenfold, if not 20-fold. If they were raking in a few billion during the 80s, they were now earning in the tens of billions. Then there's NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Thousands of tariffs on goods are phased out. The number of trucks crossing the border doubles. That means less inspections and more drugs pouring through. So what we're seeing is a new mold for the typical kingpin. They now lord over transnational, heavy volume, and practically neoliberal enterprises. All of this power and wealth now seriously shifts the power dynamic between the Mexican state and the Mexican traffickers. Now it's the traffickers who are calling the shots. The state officials are their lackeys. The political conditions in Mexico at the time are also ripe for this. What we see throughout the 90s is the weakening of the Mexican state. They're facing armed insurrections, financial crises, gang-related scandals. The PRI system is fracturing, and it's also losing administrative territory to its political opposition, the PAN or PAN party. This new wave of traffickers is paying significantly more in bribe money, but then it's got this newfound power. So, I repeat, the agencies they've bought off are now essentially working for them, not the inverse. Now it's the traffickers who are the plaza bosses, not state agencies. And these plazas are being enforced by brutal private armies, handpicked by the traffickers themselves, and on their payrolls. 7. The Zetas. The Zetas are one of those private armies I just mentioned, but few at the time could have predicted just how much they changed the Mexican cartel scene forever. And it's not just because they were the cartel equivalent of ISIS. So, as many of you will know, the Zetas get their start in the late 1990s as the private army of the Gulf Cartel. At first, the core group is made up of ex-military guys who'd recently deserted or resigned, a lot of them from Mexico's US-trained special forces. They start out as sort of elite bodyguards for a Gulf kingpin. Then they become the cartel's armed wing. Then they become a fully fledged criminal organization in their own right. The Zetas change the game, broadly speaking, in 3 ways. First, they massively accelerate the militarization of the cartels. The original members had top-of-the-range military training, including by the US and Israel's Mossad. So they set up the gang like a paramilitary group. They develop training camps, for example. They hire Guatemalan death squads. The Zetas are regimented, they are efficient, and they are psychopathically clinical. 2. Gang violence. This is the famous one. Decapitation, mutilation, horrific torture and executions. The Zetas seriously up the ante. Psychological warfare and terror are a huge part of their MO, and frankly make even the Arellano Felixes look like confused teenagers. 3. The Zetas are the first Mexican cartel to make big money off of protection rackets. You know, the age-old mafia-style pay up in exchange for our protection, and if not, we'll kill you. When the Zetas start out, they're not really business-minded traffickers. They don't have the know-how. They don't have good links to the Colombians. What they do have, though, are military expertise. So that facilitates armed expansion, warfare, and turns out controlling civilians through fear. Their key innovation is moving into territories and extorting the local criminals. First in Gulf strongholds like Tamaulipas, and then further around the country. This could be anybody from independent smugglers to DVD pirates. But then they bring in another innovation. They start shaking down licit businesses. So farmers, shopkeepers, restaurants, you name it. They become embedded in local economies. Civilians who refuse are murdered or otherwise forced into their ranks. Now, this was virtually unprecedented in Mexico. Traffickers had typically kept the violence within the trade. Now, for the first time, huge numbers of innocent civilians were being roped into cartel violence. All of these features, the militarization of the cartels, the extreme violence, the moving into territories to control businesses, this now starts to become the norm across the Mexican cartels. To compete with or fight the Zetas, other cartels have to adapt to their standards. So this means extortion actually becomes more widespread than trafficking. It's easy money, it's low risk, and it's predictable. Most Mexicans don't bother reporting the crimes as they face a real risk of getting murdered for it. Which leads us to a crucial point. Much of the gang violence we see nowadays boils down to turf wars of rival cartels trying to extort people and local businesses, from avocado farmers to construction workers to hotel owners. The Zetas essentially paved the way for the diversification of the cartel's economic activities. The Zetas also pioneer some other things, which we now see across other cartels, controlling migrant routes to brutally extort Central American refugees, sex trafficking, and this next one's now a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, oil theft and its sale on the black market. All in all, the Zetas were the prototype for the modern cartel. 8. Calderón's War. In late 2006, the new president Felipe Calderón declares war on Mexico's cartels, and he sends in the Mexican military, first to his native state of Michoacán and then to other states. Now, initially, it made for good politics. The cartels were out of control. Mexicans were sick of the cartels, and Calderón was bringing about law and order. By the end of his presidency, just 6 years later, cartel-related violence would have claimed an estimated 80,000 lives. At first, sending in the military seems like a good move. In the first year or so, you see big busts, major arrests, and administration that's finally taken action. But then the violence explodes. Now, the impact of this war is complex. It varies state by state, conflict by conflict, year by year, but there are some trends. First, the military heavily relies on the kingpin strategy. This takes down capos and disrupts organizations, but it also brings murderous power struggles and, more often than not, the fragmentation of cartels. This is the Hydra effect. Now you have more rival cartels at each other's throats, vying for control and power. In the case of the Sinaloa cartel, there is good evidence that rotten elements of Calderón's administration were protecting the operations of certain kingpins while going after others. This also included former associates. So you don't just see violence between rival cartels, say the Gulf cartel and the Sinaloa cartel. Now you see bitter violence from factions within the same cartel, like Sinaloa. And the violence is especially bitter in this case, as both factions know each other's operations intimately. But what are some of the other consequences of Calderón's war on the cartels? Well, Calderón's administration expects the cartels to fall in line. What happens, though, is they actively take the state head on. The military offensive brings an explosion of attacks on police and officials. It brings armed confrontations with the military, kidnappings and assassinations of municipal leaders. And following the Zeta playbook, the cartels militarize exponentially in the face of the military onslaught. What else? Well, you also have the military committing huge numbers of abuses, torture, forced disappearances, massacres, extrajudicial killings. Human rights atrocities make for bad politics. Overall, Mexicans had initially supported the military operations, but the failure to bring the cartels to heel and the military's own disregard for the law made the crackdown doubly unpopular. With this and the war wariness, military operations became less proactive and more reactive, called during particularly bad flare-ups. All of this, by the way, is not to say Calderón's escalation was the only cause of the violence. What led to the cartel scene of 21st century Mexico was the result of processes spanning decades, as we've seen. But what Calderón's war does is it both inflames and accelerates the violence, with both short-term and long-term consequences. Short-term consequence, the explosion of violence in a variety of complex ways and all across the country. Long-term consequence, but it's a compounding one, it accelerates the fragmentation of the cartels. There are now hundreds of criminal groups around Mexico, vying for territory, economic sources, routes, and ports of entry, who call themselves cartels. They have become exponentially defiant of state authority, and they have become increasingly militarized and heavily armed, with weapons largely flowing out of the United States. 9. The CJNG. The Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación is a sign of how far the cartels have come. It is one of the greatest security threats to come out of Mexico in recorded history. More than any cartel since the Zetas, it has blurred the line between organized crime and insurgent force. What makes them unique is not just their scale, but their willingness and ability to directly confront the Mexican state. Okay, so first a bit of context. By the mid-2000s, what's known as the Sinaloa cartel had established itself as Mexico's most powerful criminal organization. It was headed by a cabal of veteran Sinaloan traffickers, most of whom got their starts in the 70s. So, how did they become so successful? Well, first, they had good links to Colombian suppliers. Very important. Second, they controlled key, relatively peaceful trafficking corridors on the Pacific. Third, they were masterful corruptors of Mexican state and federal officials, often outbribing their rivals. And fourth, they operated like a federation, so semi-autonomous factions under one fairly informal umbrella group. This gave the cartel some resilience, say when major arrests or big busts happened. Another faction can step up when another is down. It's also a double-edged sword, as it can lead to savage infighting if trust between the factions breaks down, and it often does. So, in the mid-2000s, the Sinaloa cartel does something quite bold. It pushes into territory run by the Gulf Cartel to invade smuggling corridors in the Gulf states. In doing so, they get wrapped up in a virtual war of extermination with the Zetas, whom they massively underestimate. To keep pace with their rivals, as we've seen, the Sinaloan cartel becomes much more militarized. They use heavy weapons, they use extreme violence. They even join in the scramble for territorial control to extort businesses, both licit and illicit. At the same time, they're also hugely successful at going global. They link up with criminal groups on 5 continents. Besides dominating the North American market, they lead the great penetration of the European market. But in the early 2010s, Mexico and the world see the rise of a new cartel, the CJNG. In just a few years, the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación emerges to become the leading counterbalance to the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. Their power, their wealth, and their international presence today are comparable. Basically, they achieve in about a decade what the Sinaloa cartel had achieved in over 3. They expand hyper-aggressively all across the country to dominate territories to extort, trafficking corridors, strategic ports, and drug markets. By 2024 to 2025, they were active in at least 27 of Mexico's 31 states. They were absolutely key to the Mexican cartel's switch to synthetic drugs like fentanyl through links to suppliers in India and particularly China. These are drugs which, as you know, are behind record levels of fatal overdoses around the world, particularly in the US. The CJNG is involved in a range of criminal enterprises, many of which the Zetas helped pioneer. In simple terms, the CJNG develop at lightning pace as something of a hybrid between 2 of Mexico's most powerful and consequential cartels, the Sinaloa cartel and the Zetas. So why the Sinaloa cartel? Because of 1, the CJNG's international presence, 2, their business orientation, 3, their broad economic portfolio, 4, their insidious corrupting power, and 5, their Robin Hood-style PR strategies to win hearts and minds. Now, how do they resemble the Zetas? Well, in their aggressive but hyper-efficient territorial takeovers and extortion rackets, in their use of spectacular violence as psychological warfare, which has taken on new heights in the age of social media. And because, like the Zetas, it looks much like a paramilitary insurgent group actively confronting the state, something which Sinaloa, previously anyway, did much less of. Now, you've got many Mexican cartels who are emulating the CJNG just to thrive and survive, which is something else. In the last couple of decades, cartels have formed just to resist encroachments from more aggressive ones. Case in point, after the CJNG was created, they teamed up with the Sinaloa cartel to resist the Zetas. They called themselves Matazetas, or Zeta Killers. Today, they're at war with the Sinaloa cartel, or at least one faction of it. In another game-changing event, the CJNG has exported their insurgency-style conflict to South America by linking up with criminal groups in Ecuador, gangs which have since also taken on the state. The most powerful of these, and the most powerful in Ecuador in fact, is Los Lobos. The CJNG also has a presence in around 50 US states. It was recorded that in 2024, virtually 80% of cartel-related crimes involved the CJNG. And since the death of El Mencho, we certainly won't be hearing the last of them. Mexico's cartels now operate as shadow governments across swathes of Mexico. They intimidate, bribe, even fund the campaigns of state officials to advance cartel interests. Those who resist are usually killed or silenced. There is good evidence that presidential campaigns are financed by major drug lords to advance their organization's interests. So this is where we are now. It's not just corruption, it's not even just high corruption, it's state capture. It's narco-democracy at play. So, just to recap with a few takeaways, drug trafficking started out as rural, largely peaceful and cooperative. It is now nationwide, predatory, and fraught with extreme violence. Although it's the main moneymaker for the big cartels, most criminal organizations in Mexico, in fact, are barely involved in drugs, if at all. The violence in the Mexican drug trade has always been more about control over territory, so taxing traffickers or businesses, both illicit and licit, than drug trafficking itself. The Mexican state, first at the state level, then at the federal level, was instrumental in developing the plaza system, and up to about the 1980s, it was the state that inflicted more violence than the traffickers themselves in its efforts to control and profit from the narcotics trade. Counter-narcotics, whether that's military force or the use of confidential informants by the DEA, has been a huge driver of division and violence among traffickers. The kingpin strategy in Mexico so far has not worked. It hasn't worked in quelling the violence, and it hasn't worked in stopping the flow of drugs. In fact, it's usually done the opposite. So, what is the next turning point? Well, the history of modern Mexico is rapidly unfolding before our eyes. The Trump administration has designated a plethora of Latin American criminal groups, mostly Mexican cartels, as terrorist organizations. This gives his administration much greater legal and military tools to take them head on. Could this be the next turning point in the history of Mexico's drug wars? We have already seen the takeout of the great Venezuelan kingpin Nicolás Maduro, capo of the world-famous Cartel de los Soles. We have seen the CIA's instrumental involvement in the assassination of CJNG boss of bosses El Mencho, and more recently, we've seen the start of US military strikes on cartel infrastructure in Ecuador. Let's see if and how this hawkish and erratic American regime inflicts even more chaos south of its border.